Hello YouTube, it's Hometown here, and today we're gonna be taking a very close look at what many consider to be the most controversial horror comic of all time. The older ones among you may be familiar with Twisted Tales, a horror comics anthology published between November of 1982 and December of 1984, during which time it released a total of 10 issues. Each issue of Twisted Tales contained an average of 4 short horror stories, some a bit more, some a bit less, which became infamous for featuring generous amounts of graphic violence and female nudity, as well as for their delivery of unexpected twist endings. Now, out of all the stories that appeared in the pages of Twisted Tales, there was one very specific tale that featured such shockingly violent and questionable imagery that not only had readers sending in letters expressing their disgust at the subject matter, but apparently even had some retailers refusing to sell the issue and threatening to take the rest of the Twisted Tales issues off the shelves as well. The story in question here is Banjo Lessons, which I stumbled upon 12 years ago in some long-forgotten website without actually being aware of its controversial nature. Needless to say, I read through it and... Jesus Christ, man, that was both the most brilliantly written as well as most fucked up thing I've ever read in my entire life, and I've read some really fucked up things. Now, I will be presenting the whole comic to you because I want us to discuss it a bit afterwards, but before I do that, I feel the need to issue a huge trigger warning to all viewers. This story is really messed up, features lots of violence and animal abuse, and boasts one of the most disturbing panels of all time in its last page, so if you're sensitive to that kind of content, this video is not for you. So, for those of you still around, let's go over Banjo Lessons. Shit man, this will get really dark really fast. The story begins with a good old-fashioned American barbecue where an asshole named Carter is beating up a dog for having peed at the edge of a table while his friends, Sim, Rance, and Jimbo are chilling in the background. An unseen narrator explains how he has no idea how everything went down, saying that he doesn't remember clearly what happened and why. If you're already confused, so was I, but everything will make sense in a moment. Rance and Jimbo are checking out a new gun Rance bought as Sim is sipping some beer next to them when, all of a sudden, Sim gets up, grabs the shotgun and proceeds to walk toward Carter in an almost hypnotized state. He aims the shotgun toward the crotch of a confused Carter and then proceeds to blast it to high hell. Rance attempts to stop him but gets a mouthful of lead for his effort, and when Jimbo goes for a Hail Mary by placing him in a headlock, Sim just throws him on the barbecue grill, which immediately engulfs him in flames. We are then shown that the narrator is Sim, who is in a holding cell while being questioned by his lawyer, Mr. Brinks. Sim reiterates that he has no idea why he did what he did, especially considering that Carter, Rance, and Jimbo were his best friends, and seems resigned to his fate and unwilling to care about the situation he is in, much to the dismay of Brinks, who is getting increasingly desperate since this seems to be a lost case already. The next day, Brinks decides to prod further into Sim's relationship with his 3 deceased friends in hopes of finding something that would help with his defense. He inquires about Sim's activities with them, and the man says that they used to do a lot of fishing and hunting together. Brinks asks if Sim or any of the others ever owned a dog, since Carter's abuse of the animal seemed to have been the trigger for the mayhem during the barbecue, and Sim says that Carter used to own canines, which apparently brings forth an unpleasant memory involving a black Labrador. The lawyer asks him to elaborate, and Sim reluctantly begins to narrate an old excursion of theirs. He says that a little over a decade ago, the 4 friends went on a hunting trip at an isolated cabin up in the mountains, and Carter showed up with a beautiful black dog. Carter introduced the dog as Banjo, and over the next few days of their hunting escapade, he demonstrated his dominance over the animal by making it fetch things for him, as well as abusing it by not feeding it and forcing it to sleep outside in the cold shed. Sim explains how he felt bad for the dog sleeping out of the cabin in freezing temperatures, which he seems to have taken an intense liking to, as he keeps referencing how enamored he was with its big brown eyes. When Brinks asks about the fate of the dog, Sim says that he's not sure, but figures it probably died, and then trails off while thinking of the dog's eyes. The lawyer proceeds to visit Carter's wife and asks if she remembers any unusual incident involving Sim, Carter, and Banjo the dog, but Mrs. Carter seems unable to recall Banjo, though she figures that's normal given how many pets Carter used to own. Brinks returns to Sim to continue their conversation, and Sim gets incredibly aggressive when the lawyer goes to sit on his bed, yelling that it's his bed and he can do whatever he wants with it. Brinks calls him down and once again inquires about the fate of the dog. Sim dives back into his memories and recalls how abusive Carter was with the canine, constantly beating and degrading it with increased fervor. He then explains that given the harshness of the winter that year, they became snowed in and couldn't leave the cabin, with their excursion suddenly having turned to a fight for survival as food and other resources began to dwindle. During one of those cold nights, Carter entered Sim's room and found him in bed with a dog, which sent him in a fit of rage. Sim tried to explain that he just wanted Banjo to stay warm, but Carter just went ahead and beat the dog senseless once more, an experience that probably had something to do with Sim's outburst toward Brinks previously. As days went by, the group eventually ran out of food, at which point Carter announced that it was time for desperate measures, and Sim watched in horror as his three friends dragged Banjo out to the shed, with the man saying that he can still remember the dog's screams as they all disappeared from sight before the sound of gunshots echoed across the air, which led to a disturbing feast of which he didn't want to be a part. We now jump to Sim's trial, where Brinks has just narrated that story to the court. The lawyer proceeds to ask Sim why him and his friends never shared that ordeal with anyone, given that Mrs. Carter had no recollection neither of that incident nor the dog, meaning that her husband never mentioned it to her. Sim starts fumbling around with his words, trying to make an excuse of having forgotten about it before letting it half slip that Carter swore him not to tell. Brinks catches on to that and presses him even further, asking why would Carter make him swear not to share that story with anyone. As Sim begins to crack, Brinks demands that Sim repeat what he heard the dog doing the night of its death. Sim says he heard it howling, but Brinks rebuffs that the word he had used was screaming, and dogs don't scream now, do they? The man continues his relentless barrage of questions, demanding that Sim share what truly happened back at the cabin, and that's where things get completely fucked up. Before I move forward, this is your last warning to click off the video, since the next page is sickening, so if there was ever a time to jump ship, this is it. I'm serious, this is some fucked up shit, okay? Okay, for those of you still here, let's do this. Turns out Banjo was not a dog but a black man that Carter had brought up to the cabin, and we get an encore of the abusive scenes we had witnessed earlier, but this time with the actual Banjo as the disturbing imagery culminates to their inhumane feast, an image that has stayed with me to this day. Brinks asks Sim if the reason for not telling anyone about that incident was his fear of Carter retaliating by sharing how he found him and Banjo in bed, and the story ends with Sim having a nervous breakdown as he keeps denying that he ever did anything wrong with Banjo, both in bed and at that horrific table. Now that you've seen the story in full, you can probably understand why it upset a significant number of people. You see, to a good number of readers, this was an abhorrent piece of work promoting the treatment of people of color as inferior objects, also known as racism, and also to a smaller degree homophobia, due to Sim's obvious sexual attraction to Banjo, which led to the somewhat vague bedroom situation. However, in my humble opinion, what these detractors failed to understand is that this story advocated for the exact opposite. This is not a tale supporting racism and homophobia, it is a tale condemning them. The horrible treatment of Banjo at the hands of Carter and eventually Rance and Jimbo is not meant to be celebrated, but to be analyzed as a horrifying argument on the extreme lengths people can go when they don't perceive others as equals or as human beings. You're not supposed to identify with these three murderers, you are supposed to stare at their actions with morbid dread and wish for them to get what they deserve. The same goes for the homophobic aspect of the story. Sim clearly comes across as a closeted gay man who is afraid of coming out, which makes sense given the time period the story transpires in, which I assume is the early 80s, which would put the whole Banjo incident during the early 70s. Those decades weren't exactly the dark ages for gay people, but they were also by no means anywhere near the levels of acceptance we have today. His fear also makes sense considering the people he has surrounded himself with, especially Carter, who is the epitome not only of the bigot but also the homophobe, which is proven when, during the bedroom incident, Sim says that Carter never looked at him the same way again, describing Carter's stare as if looking at a leper. Similarly to the racist aspect of the story, this situation is not portrayed as a good thing. Throughout the story you can clearly see Sim's frustration and pain, which led to a trauma so big that he actually blocked out the existence of Banjo from his brain, both because of the man's horrific fate, but also because Banjo's memory was a reminder of Sim's suppressed true self, as hinted by Brink's comment near the end when he surmises that Sim never spoke of this story because he was scared Carter would reveal his moment with Banjo in the bedroom. To this day, there are people perceiving this as a comic supporting these horrible aspects of humanity instead of going against them, which baffles me when considering how artistic works usually approach such sensitive subjects when they want to portray them in a negative light. Any sort of creative work that is anti-something usually goes on to show the horrible aspects of that something as a means of making people condemn whatever that something is. Take anti-war movies, for example. These aren't films that go on to show how peaceful the lives of people would be if war wasn't a thing. They're movies demonstrating the horrors of war, so that you, the viewer, can understand that this is something you never want to experience. Off the top of my head, Saving Private Ryan is one of the biggest anti-war films out there, and it contains one of the most brutal and disturbing close-quarter fights ever. If you've watched the film, you know the scene I'm talking about, you've had nightmares related to that scene. So with that same logic, that was the approach that was taken with this story, which is something that one of the editors of Twisted Tales, namely April Campbell, also confirmed in the editorial of that issue by stating, and I quote, "I've been asked to write an editorial stating our views on the subject of racism, just in case the completely anti-racist stance of the story is misinterpreted or the language in the story misunderstood as condoning the very behavior it condemns. I don't believe that there is a mature reader in the world who would misinterpret the strong anti-racist stance of Banjo Lessons as advocating bigotry simply because some of the characters in it are bigots." With all that being said, I'm curious to hear your own thoughts on this comic horror story. Do you find it in support or in opposition to the heinous behavior it portrays? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe if you liked this video, and remember to stay spooky!